Is the business we will be even well, we will be looking at issues of global power and how that interrelates to business. So, in exploring this idea of corporate imperialism and international dominance, we'll take the Nestle Corporation as an example of this, but it's not by any stretch of the imagination the only one that could be classed as engaging in corporate imperialism. Once we've explored some of the historical backdrops, how notions of imperialism have built up over the centuries, and how that's transitioned from the world of politics to the world of business, although it is not entirely confined to the world of business, it does leach out into other areas. We'll then move on to talking about the conflict between the right to life of individual citizens versus the right to profit by large-scale corporations, but for that matter, it could equally apply to medium and small-sized corporations. So, first off, thinking in terms of what constitutes corporate imperialism. At the moment, what we're tending to see in the world are mostly Western-based multinationals expanding their territories into China and India and Africa. But there are obviously Eastern-based multinationals that also engage in imperialist behaviours and outlooks, both ones that exist currently at the present day, but also ones that have existed at various different points in time. So this isn't an exclusively Western-based thing. This is something that manifests the whole globe over as businesses get bigger and bigger and bigger. And then instead of just wanting to operate within the bounds of one country, they start looking at other countries as both potential marketplaces for possible customers to sell their goods to, but also in terms of places that they can get raw materials from and places that they can set up factories or farms or whatever it is that's required for that particular style of corporation, and then start recruiting workers from foreign countries other than the one in which that corporation was originally based. Prahalad and Lieberthal describe this as a form of corporate imperialism, their argument being that over the last couple of thousand years we've seen political imperialism. China had an empire, India had an empire, Britain had an empire, Rome had an empire, Belgium had an empire. Everywhere at some point, almost everywhere, at some point has had an empire where one country goes around conquering other countries and then makes them client kingdoms, subsidiary parts to its own power. Sometimes exploits those countries for mineral resources, sometimes for slaves, sometimes for food, all sorts of other things. And part of that sort of imperial empire building is also the spread of the culture of the original country, of the dominant country. So the now conquered territory is that the people in that territory are encouraged to learn the language of the conquering country and take on board the social customs of the conquering country and so on. So Prahalad and Lieberthal describe corporations behaving in the same way as empires in previous centuries, that they expand their territory into new countries and then introduce their corporate culture, their branding, their marketing, their whole kind of glossy product spin to the new country they've well, you can either say conquered or taken under their wing, depending on how you want to view the process. There are problems which Prahalad and Lieberthal flag up from a business point of view, as well as the sort of political and ethical problems caused by sometimes quite ruthless business practices. But from a purely business angle, one of the potential problems that they flag up is that a business, a corporation that's used to operating in one country might start to assume that people in a second, third, fourth country will act in much the same way as people in the mother country. So in terms of wanting to buy the same things or responding to the same style of advertising or being willing to work under the same conditions in their factories or other premises. And that's not always the case. Different countries obviously have very different cultures and what works well in one culture may not work well in a second culture. And so that can fall flat as corporations expand and fail to take on board the uniqueness of the various different cultures that they're expanding into. That's the business side of it. The more moral human side of it is the sheer ruthlessness of some corporations in how they treat their customers, their employees, their supply chains in various different countries, whether they target certain countries because the rates of pay and expectations in some countries are much, much lower than in other countries. And so they can effectively get away with hiring cheap labor and engaging in business practices that would be completely illegal in the mother country, but are feasible in the new territories into which that multinational has expanded. And so there can be some very shoddy practices going on. And we will look at a few examples of shoddy practices as we roll along. But first to highlight that this is not a phenomenon of the 21st century or even the 20th century. This is something that has been going around for several hundred years now. And so we can go back to the East India Company in Britain, and that's one of the ones we'll have a look at in a bit more detail. But just as the East India Company was building up and expanding into India and various other parts of the world, where the kind of fueling the growth of the British Empire, so there was a French East Indies Company and a Dutch East India Company. There are a variety of European empires, nations whose political imperialism was fueled and supported and advanced by the corporate imperialism of theoretically independent companies. So we'll look at some examples of those as we roll along. So we'll start with the East India Company. Now that received its royal charter from Queen Elizabeth I in the year 1600 and has been rolling along, I was going to say ever since. It no longer exists per se, but it remained in existence for many, many hundreds of years. And there are still businesses that exist today that are offshoots of things started by the East India Company hundreds of years ago. So having received their royal charter to start trading with India and engaging with India and other nations and expanding, they initially spent the first couple of hundred years looking at simply trade, buying and selling all sorts of goods from one country to another, chiefly from Britain to India and other parts of the world, back and forth in both directions. But gradually, as the decades ticked on, by the time they rolled into the 18th century, they'd started to get an appetite not only for trade, but for territory, for wanting to own land. And not simply in the sense of building a factory and owning the land on which a factory was built, but rather to actually own their own territories, to become like a mini country in their own right and buy up sections of India and various other places. Partly this was on the back of the collapse of the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire is one of a whole series of empires that have come to dominance in India. Some of those empires have been Hindu empires, but the Mughal Empire was a Muslim empire that had invaded India, and for centuries the Hindus of India, and indeed the Christians of India and the various other religions, the Sikhs and so on of India, were under the dominance of Islam. Some of those rulers were really horrifically brutal. We'll have a look at Aurangzeb, one of the worst examples of a Mughal emperor, as we go along. Slaughtered vast numbers of people. But as the Mughal Empire started to decline and collapse in on itself, it created a power void in India, and as well as various local princes and rajas and what have you, vying with each other to fill that power gap. So you also had British business interests vying to fill that power gap, and indeed the French India Company vying to fill that power gap. So it wasn't just the British. We don't need to castigate our own history as somehow significantly worse than anybody else's history, because we were just one of the vultures trying to peck at the collapsing corpse of the Mughal Empire and make a profit out of it. By the time we get to 1803, The British East India's Company had it acquired its own army. Let's have a think about this. This is a business. They used to trade in tea and spices and things like that. They now have, within 200 years of starting up, their own army. That's a bit like Tesco's or Sainsbury's or something having its own army, if you can imagine such a thing. And the army that was hired, these are all mercenaries, people who work for direct pay from the directors of the East India Company, was around about 260,000 people, which was twice the size of the British Army. Now imagine that, let's say, Asda had an army, its own private army that was twice the size of the British Army. Can you imagine that? It's just bizarre, but that's the way it went. Why did they need an army? Well, to some extent, some of these soldiers acted rather like security guards protecting trading ships and vessels and caravans going back and forth to make sure they weren't robbed and raided and the rest of it. But primarily it was because of this appetite the directors of that company had acquired for gaining land. You can't gain land without military force to both invade the land in the first place and then protect it from anybody else who might want to take the land off you. So that's what they used their soldiers for in the first instance, the protection of their land. But there's also examples and evidence of these mercenaries being deployed to attack rival corporations and companies, raid ships, that sort of thing, engage in what is essentially acts of piracy. This iron rod of rulership existed in India from 1753 and trundled on for 101 years to 1858. So it went on and went on and went on, only being brought to an end with the Indian Rebellion and the formation of the Government of India Act, which was an attempt to placate the rebellion and achieve a greater degree of stability. With the Government of India Act, that was the British government effectively creating the Raj, creating British rulership in India, rulership by politicians, rulership by government, rather than rulership by private business. So prior to that, the East India Company had effectively been trying to rule large chunks of India. Now, India is a very, very large country. It's something in the region of 13 odd times the size of Britain. So it's a big country. Rulership of the whole of India was just not feasible in that day and age, not by a foreign nation at any rate, although the Mughals had a damn good crack at it. So the East India Company wasn't trying to rule the whole of India, it was just trying to rule as much of India as it could stake a claim to. And their rule was pretty horrific. I mean, the British Raj rule was no fun for anybody, but the East India Company had been much worse. So this was a slight move forward in terms of lessening the tyranny of the foreign occupation and making it slightly more accountable to a rule of law. Still not perfect, still not ideal, still an awful lot of abuses and awful things took place, but slightly less of them than had been taking place under the governance of the East India Company. How did the East India Company kick off, you may possibly ask? If you actually care, I don't know. I'm going to tell you anyway. It kicked off back in the 1600s under the lead of Sir James Lancaster, who charted the Red Dragon ship on its first voyage across to India as a trade vessel. Officially a trade vessel, however. They engaged in a fair amount of piracy. Now, the only real difference between a buccaneer and a pirate is that buccaneers have a degree of political support from a country. So they're not stealing on their own behalf. They are raiding a foreign ship, taking whatever can be hoiked off that ship, and then giving it to the crown, rather than keeping it for their own jollies. Which doesn't, of course, mean that there might not have been a few fingers in the till, and people skimming off a bit of the profit for their own entertainment. but the bulk of the wealth that was raided from one ship was given from foreign ships was given over to the British Crown. So they are in effect licensed buccaneers rather than self-employed pirates. And they were so successful in their raiding, not just on that one voyage, but on a whole series of voyages, that they started opening warehouses to keep the stolen goodies in, and then using those stolen goodies as the bedrock for initial trade routes. So as well as starting to build more normal forms of trade with farmers and merchants and what have you in India, they were also stealing from French ships, stealing from Portuguese ships, stealing from any other ship that they could lay hands to take their profits of them, because Britain was slightly late to the game when it came to wanting to exploit the natural resources of India. So they, I suppose these days we might call it a hostile takeover bid from various other European trading nations. At a similar point in time, we have the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, also setting up their business empire, their trading empire. By the early 1600s, they had 50,000 employees across the world. That is an insane amount of people to employ. Well, it's a hell of a lot of people to employ today, but it's an insane amount of people to employ in the early 1600s. And they had their own fleet of 200 ships going back and forth between Holland, the Netherlands, and India. And the rivalry between the Dutch ships and the British ships and the Portuguese ships and the French ships was so intense that these various different forces would go to war with each other. And what were effectively merchant navy ships had to become armed or be accompanied by ships that were armed, because they would fire cannon on each other and raid each other, and full-on piracy taking place, as it's stealing the trade goods and slaughtering the sailors and all sorts of horrendous things going on between various different rival nations. Just between the Netherlands and Britain alone, 4 wars broke out. Not just between what don't mean the wars between the ships, but official declared wars between the Netherlands and Britain itself, in response to the punch-ups going on between the Dutch East India and the British East India Company. So it's rather like if Tesco's and Walmart were raiding each other's lorries and trucks, and then America and Britain went to war with each other because 2 supermarket chains had gone to war with each other. It just seems an utterly bizarre thing to imagine in this day and age, but it's pretty much what was happening in the 1600s as a result of the sheer clout that these companies had, that they could rope in their own governments to fight wars on their behalf against their business rivals and against the governments that controlled were also under the clout of their business rivals. If we go to the 1740s, or 1740 itself, as an example of some of the horrific things went on, the Dutch East India Company had a lot of interests in a part of the world that these days we call Jakarta, but back then was referred to as Batavia, countries changing their name on a somewhat sporadic basis as they do. As well as the native Batavians, all the people who had originally lived in that country, various different companies, including the Dutch East India, as well as some other business interests, had brought in large numbers of Chinese migrant workers to come and live in Batavia and work in the factories, work in the fields, act as merchants and traders, but treated them very, very badly. They were very poorly paid, long hours, terrible exploitation, the kind of thing that you've all been looking at in terms of the textile industry in Britain in your essay, various essays, the kind of horrible conditions those women were working under and children were working under was pretty much the same conditions that the Chinese were working under in Batavia, until the Chinese started to unionize and try to rebel against the tyranny of the Dutch East India Company and demand better conditions. So the response of the Dutch East India Company was to whip up anger amongst the native population who resented the Chinese because they'd been put out of jobs themselves, and the usual things when a large number of foreign people move into any country. The native population often gets a bit shirty and thinks, who the hell are these foreigners with their strange language and their weird food and everything else? We don't like them, we don't understand them. You get all of those resentments that build up in any part of the world when a large influx of foreign people come in. And so they whipped up that resentment and incited and then armed an uprising that resulted in the deaths of 10,000 of the Chinese immigrants who were only there because the Dutch East India Company brought them there in the first place, and then effectively incited them to be slaughtered because they were demanding better working conditions. Were any charges brought against the Dutch East India Company? Was anyone held to account? Of course they weren't. So a horrific large-scale massacre with no legal account for the people most centrally responsible for it. Some of the natives were executed for their participation in the uprising and the slaughter, but by and large there was very little accountability for anyone as a result of this. Just horrendous incident. And again, could you imagine something like that happening in the modern world, let's say modern day Britain or America or Australia or anywhere really, that a business might whip up and incite an armed rebellion that could lead to the slaughter? I mean, you've got a fair number of sort of Central European workers in Britain at the moment. Just imagine some company in Britain whipping up a massacre that led to the slaughter of 10,000 Polish people or Latvian people or Lithuanian people. That would be unimaginable in 21st century Britain. And if some company even had to try at it, I think the courts would crush them to a pulp. The public outcry would be so intense. But this is the sort of thing that was going on, not only in this particular instance in Batavia. There are other comparable cases in other parts of the world where various multinational companies were instigating massacres and slaughters and just horrendous behaviour and getting away with it. The rule of law in 1740 was not quite what the rule of law is in 2020. Now, the chap in the painting there, in the picture, is one of the Mughal leaders from the Mughal Empire that we mentioned a few minutes ago. This is Aurangzeb. Now, some of the Mughal emperors were famed for their religious tolerance, that at certain junctures the Mughal imperial court included Muslims and Hindus and Sikhs and Christians and all sorts of people from different religious backgrounds from not only India itself, but from neighbouring territories, who came as scholars and politicians and one thing and another to serve some of the, by and large, more tolerant Muslim emperors. I say by and large because even the very tolerant ones were, when all is said and done, emperors who were not adverse to slaughtering their enemies, often in quite large scale. So tolerance on this occasion is a somewhat subjective notion, shall we say. But Aurangzeb is not one of the tolerant ones. He is one of the far more brutal ones. A religious fanatic. He had members of his own family murdered in quite gruesome ways, which is not uncommon in all fairness amongst imperial families to bump one another off. That sort of thing does go on, but he was particularly notorious for it and had a particular hatred of the native Hindu population of India. Despised them, wanted to convert the whole of India to Islam, and absolutely loathed the Hindus who refused to convert, saw them as a kind of a subhuman species. And over the course of his rulership, during the course of several decades, he massacred, slaughtered around 4.6 million Hindus. Bearing in mind Hitler got through, 6 million Jews and gypsies and disabled people and gay people and so on. So this is not far off that number, 4.6 million, a vast number of Hindus slaughtered during his reign. And he slaughtered others as well. He slaughtered Sikhs too, he slaughtered Jains, he slaughtered various people. But the Hindus got the brunt of his rage, his fury. And so in India itself, Aurangzeb is looked back on these days in much the same way that we look back in Britain on Hitler, as a particularly despicable, awful, monstrous ruler responsible for grand-scale destruction and loss of life. A much, much hated man these days in India, as I'm sure he was in his own lifetime, let alone these days. However, now we've set a background to what a horrendous character Aurangzeb was. In 1695, Captain Henry Every raided one of the treasure ships belonging to Aurangzeb, possibly not realizing at the time he raided it that it did indeed belong to Aurangzeb, and loaded himself up with a vast fortune. Now, in order to keep Aurangzeb sweet and prevent him from hurling the British out of India, whilst Henry Every was a pirate, he wasn't a buccaneer. In other words, he was acting with his own remit rather than having been directed by the British government. The attitude of Aurangzeb was that one damned Englishman was much the same as any other damned Englishman, and if one of them behaved appallingly, he'd get rid of the entire lot of them. He didn't want any of them around. So he wasn't distinguishing between pirates and business corporations and governments. It was just the British in general were just, one scumbag was much the same as any other scumbag kind of an attitude. And so he was quite prepared to end all relations, trade relations with the British, and sling the East Indies Company out on its ear. So to keep him sweet, the East India Company not only reimbursed Aurangzeb for his enormous fortune of pearls and rubies and diamonds and gold and silver and whatnot that had been hiked off the ship by Captain Every, but they organised a manhunt for Every and eventually laid hands to him and continued to deal with. So Aurangzeb was happy once that was done and allowed the company to remain in India and continue to deal and trade with the Indians and with him. So in effect, it is somewhat akin to a company trading with Hitler and continuing to trying to keep Hitler sweet by making him good deals and things so that he will allow their company to continue trading in Nazi Germany. Because this is the kind of world leader we're talking about, someone horrendously psychopathic, responsible for vast numbers of deaths, starvations, brutal tortures. I mean, you name it, Aurangzeb did it. He is on a par with the worst of the worst in terms of world leaders. So were the businessmen of the East India Company going beyond the level of acceptability in trading with such a person? We can think of the way people rank these days when a company seem to be trading with some tyrant who's got a terrible record for slaughtering their own population. And there are calls and cries from charities and campaign groups and one thing and another saying, oh, let's boycott this business as long as they continue to trade with some horrendous despot in a far-flung part of the world. Back in 1695, obviously, well, there were charities in existence in 1695, but pressure groups and that sort of thing hadn't got into their stride and swing the way they have done in the 20th and 21st centuries. So you didn't get that kind of an outcry going on, and obviously the slowness of news going from one part of the world to another part of the world, quite different from these days of social media when we know about things 5 minutes before they've even happened half the time. How would we react today to businesses trading with someone who had slaughtered over 4.5 million citizens in their own country, or a country that they were occupying at any rate in this case? Would we be happy for that company to go on doing so? Or would the public be pressurizing them through petitions and letters and boycotts and writing to their politicians and demanding that MPs do something to prevent this company continuing to trade with some horrendously homicidal ruler of another country? I suspect that's how many, many people would behave in this day and age. Some people might not give a toss one way or the other, but many people would react badly to business dealings of that sort. Now, can we judge the people of the 17th century by the moral standards and values of the 21st century? It's a little bit of a pointless exercise, but whilst it may have been considered acceptable by the bigwigs of the East India Company just to keep on trading, keep on making a ton of money, and not give a flying donut about how many millions of Hindus died whilst they were trading with the Emperor Aurangzeb. These days, it would not go down so well as an attitude or as an approach to business. Does that mean that attitude does not exist in the 21st century? Well, clearly not. There are horrendous political tyrants around the world today, causing, well, maybe not 4.5 million deaths, maybe not quite that grand a scale, but nonetheless slaughtering and massacring and torturing and doing horrific things. And there are multinational companies trading with those countries and making a profit from those countries, and possibly having deals and sweeteners with said political tyrants to enable themselves to keep trading in those countries, because making a profit is way more important than however many hundreds or thousands or indeed millions of people get slaughtered by some swivel-eyed loon who happens to be in charge of a country. We have our own examples of companies that have, in living memory, for the very elderly these days, traded with and made profits from very, very extreme regimes. So to give you a couple of European examples, Hugo Boss, still very much in business, obviously. Back in the day, during the Second World War, they got the contract for making Nazi military uniforms for the soldiers and the SS and the various other branches of the Nazi war machine. And at one level, you might say, well, they were just making a uniform. Making clothes, is that the worst thing someone could do in the world? Well, probably not. However, one of the critical issues that is flagged up every so often in complaints against Hugo Boss is that they didn't only just make sets of clothing, sets of uniforms, they brought in slave labor to do it. So a number of their clothing factories, people who had been arrested and put in concentration camps in Poland and France were shipped into Hugo Boss factories under guard, obviously, with guns trained on them and all the rest of it to make sure they didn't escape, and forced to work as slaves for nothing, just food in exchange. Ridiculously long hours, and anyone who complained no doubt got a bullet in the back of their head, the way slaves tend to get when they step out of line in these sorts of situations. So not only did they make a huge profit, part of the hugeness of that profit was from the fact that they had unpaid slave labor. They went along with that. Now, an apologist might say, well, had the head of Hugo Boss refused the offer made to them of slave labor from the concentration camps, then the various, not only perhaps the head of Hugo Boss, but the board of directors might well have found themselves in a concentration camp themselves if they had been too disagreeable to the demands made of them by the Nazi Party. And that possibly is the case. Maybe had they not gone along with what was asked of them, maybe some of them would have been shot or imprisoned or what have you. And this is going back to this kind of moral dilemma about how far would you go to preserve your own life? If somebody puts a gun to your head and says, do this thing, and it's some horrendous, horrific thing you don't want to do you just do it in order to avoid getting a bullet in your own head? What if they say, do it or I'll kill your children? Which is a whole other ballgame, and it's the kind of threat that does get made by extremist political parties. So in other words, it's not just you who will be in the concentration camp, it's your entire family who will end up in the concentration camp if you don't do as you're told. How many of us would be willing to bite that bullet and either get shot ourselves or see our entire families carted off to a concentration camp or shot or what have you? because we wanted to be steadfast and stand by our moral values and refuse to do the horrible thing being ordered of us. A difficult one. That's not me trying to whitewash Hugo Boss. That's just a need for a bit of realism about what any of us would do if we were faced with such orders from a maniacal political regime that said, do this or else. However, once the war was over, Hugo Boss kept all of the massive profits they'd made. They didn't hold their hands up and say, look, we only did this because we ourselves were threatened with execution, the war's over, we'll make amends, we'll make payouts to those slave labourers who survived, blah, blah, blah. They didn't go down that line. They just kept the profits, thank you very much, and bankrolled themselves over the next few decades as their business grew and grew and grew. How should people in the 21st century relate to Hugo Boss? Should people boycott them because of something that was done, 80 odd years ago now? Or is that nonsensical? None of the people involved in the original decision-making processes around this wartime incident, none of them are still alive. They're not part of the business anymore. They are long since dead. Can we blame the current generation of people at Hugo Boss for decisions made decades and decades and decades ago by people who aren't around anymore? Is there room for reparations? Or is that a nonsensical idea? Holding people accountable today for something that their grandparents, great-grandparents, however many generations back you want to go, did. So if my great-great-great-granddad shot somebody else's great-great-great-granddad, do I owe money to the descendant of the man who was shot? In what world does that make a lot of sense? But equally, you might argue, and it is an argument made in the whole reparations debate, if I am still profiting and financially benefiting from the advantage my great-great-great-great-grandfather got from shooting someone, then is that blood money? And whether I make a reparation to some distant descendant or I do something else with the money as a kind of washing away of the stain of blood, is there nonetheless a sense in which that money is stained by the guilt by which it was acquired, and some act of cleansing, contrition, reparation, however you want to visualize it, some act needs to be done? Or is it all just water under the bridge? Move on, forget about the past, just count the money. How do we understand these situations? Porsche, founded by Ferdinand Porsche, who created Volkswagen and the Porsche car itself, was still working and manufacturing cars and all sorts of various other vehicles, some of them just for driving around in, and some of them for military use during the Second World War, and had his factories staffed 4/5 by slave labour, 1/5 by normal, ordinary employees who are getting paid a wage packet. Close personal friend of Himmler, and asked for slaves to be sent from Auschwitz. I suppose if it's a choice between being in Auschwitz and working in a car factory, the car factory is a very small step up from Auschwitz, but nonetheless, some very, very dark, dodgy things going on there. And again, when the war ended, kept all the profits. Thank you very much. I do know some Jewish people who will not buy the Porsche to this day because of that history, even though Ferdinand Porsche is long since dead, buried and gone, who nonetheless feel that the entire company is stained by the guilt of Ferdinand Porsche. And so they would not buy either a Volkswagen or a Porsche car to this very day because of that. I'm sure there must be other Jewish people who perhaps would buy one of those cars and maybe think, well, the past is the past, let's move on. But I've got friends who would not buy one of those, that kind of want to distance themselves from the horror that went on then, and the profiteering and the exploitation and the abuse that went on then. IG Farben, still in existence. Well, I say still in existence. Offshoots of the company of IG Farben remain in existence to this day, but they helped manufacture Zyklon B in the gas chambers when they shoveled ludicrously large numbers of people into these kind of bathroom stalls and then pumped poisonous gas in to kill them all off, men, women, and children alike. One of the chief poison gases used was Zyklon B. And IG Farben manufactured it, produced it, sent the cylinders off, and knew exactly what it was used for. So in no sense were they naive or unaware of what that gas was being utilised for. I mean, there isn't much else you could do with Zyklon B except kill people. It doesn't have many other uses. So they were fully aware of that. They took the money and they produced the gas and got on with it. They also, which in some respects is, well, I hesitate to say worse, because on the scale of these things, one horrific act being better or slightly worse than another seems an insane argument to have. But Dr. Joseph Mengele was a medical researcher who engaged in hundreds and hundreds of experiments. He organized them, conducted them, supervised them, experiments on living human beings, cutting them open whilst they were still awake and conscious, engaging in gene experimentation. I don't want to go into details because it is the kind of thing of nightmares. It's the sort of topic that would fill a horror film 5 times over. What he did to, these were Jewish prisoners, gypsy prisoners, disabled prisoners, a whole raft of people in concentration camps, where he was using them for horrific medical experimentations, just horrific. And Farben knew about it. They provided him with money. They provided him with equipment. They wanted to see the results of his experiments, to see if they could utilize any of the information he gained from those horrendous medical experiments. It's like something out of, as I say, a horror film. It is just inexplicably grotesque. Once the war came to an end, whereas Hugo Boss and the Porsche company continued on as per, IG Farben, because of this level of involvement perhaps, was broken up as a company and forced to sell off different branches. However, those branches continued. Certainly Bayer is still one of the massive chemical branches, is still in existence. Would Bayer be as big as it is without the wealth accrued during the Second World War by doing all of these unspeakably awful things? Does Bayer have blood on its hands? Does IG Farben, back in the day, have blood on its hands? How do modern day people, customers, consumers, relate to and understand the surviving arms of the IG Farben Corporation? Do you just, if you want to buy a product, do you buy a product and think, oh, well, the past is the past? Or do you make a decision to boycott and avoid a company because of things that were conducted many decades ago by people who are no longer alive or working for the company, but from whom the company financially benefited? It's a very, very murky area and a very difficult one. It's hard to know how people today, all these years on, should relate to these still surviving business corporations. But undoubtedly, as has been said by a number of different people over the centuries, war is good for business, or at least for certain businesses, in which they become very, very rich by participating in ongoing warfare. And there are indeed circumstances and situations which suggest that sometimes corporations are not above inciting and instigating and whipping up warfare in order to gain for themselves the financial advantage of selling their product during that war, and to do so in a very, what can we say, very calculating way, in that they will often, and there are accounts of companies doing exactly this, sell equipment to both sides. So it's not as if they're, a country based in Britain is going, oh, we must support the British Army, and a country based in Spain is going, oh, we must support the Spanish Army. There are multinational corporations which have arms everywhere who will sell to both sides quite merrily and make a massive profit. They don't give a damn who wins, so long as they get to sell to both sides. And if they can engage in a bit of slave labour in the process, perhaps like these companies, or engage in the kind of scientific research that would be illegal in any other period of time, but during warfare, rules slip, especially under extremist governments, they will do so and profit quite nicely. Is it down to us, the consuming public, to hold them morally and legally accountable? Because it certainly seems that governments don't. Some other examples here. Siemens, or Simons, however you prefer to pronounce that one, built the gas chambers and got paid for building the gas chambers. Are they accountable for what went on in them? Those gas chambers were designed for the intent of being. I'll give you a comparable situation. If somebody builds a prison, a company builds a prison, building firm, and one of the rooms in the prison is used as a hangman's cell to execute prisoners. Now that room isn't necessarily designed for the purpose of. It's just a room in the prison that ends up being deployed for executing people, hanging them, shooting them, and whatever it is that the particular style of execution is going to be. So it might be somewhat debatable to suggest that somehow the building firm is responsible for the executions that take place. However, if a building is constructed explicitly for the purpose of slaughtering people, and so the architects, the planners, the plumbers putting in the pipes that will filter the gas from the gas bottles through to the particular room where people are going to die in, all of those people know what this building is for. They have to know what it's for in order to design it and build it properly. Therefore, are they not complicit in what will eventually take place in that building? When they take their money and walk away at the end of the building project, is that not blood money? Chase Bank froze the banking accounts of Jewish customers all over Europe, and were very, very pally-wally with the Nazis in terms of giving them banking services and bankrolling them and financing them. Some very grim, dark things went on there. But again, we're back to this issue. The people at the bank, the people at Siemens, the people at Hugo Boss who made all of these decisions and choices are dead, buried, gone. Some companies have made token gestures. Chase Bank, I believe, has reimbursed some of the families who the survivors of Jewish families. There have been payouts there. Not all of the companies have, but some of the companies have engaged in reparative acts. So does this mean it's forgiven, forgotten, let's move on, water under the bridge? Or is it important that we need to be aware of just how bleak and horrific and exploitative the history of some of these companies is? Is it worth, not only in order to hold those companies to some degree of account, but is it worth knowing these things? Because as history teachers will love telling you time and time again, those who do not learn from the mistakes of history are doomed to repeat them. What companies are there in the world today? Let's just in Britain alone, let alone anywhere else in the world. What businesses, what companies are there in Britain today who would quite merrily, quite happily, if the worst ever happened and there was World War III and Britain was under the rulership of some modern day version of Hitler, some extremist, unhinged politician who was massacring people in vast numbers and doing dreadful, appalling things and packing people off to concentration camps. If we had some absolute monster come into power in Britain, how many of the companies around today would trade with such a person? would request prisoners from concentration camps to be sent along as slave labour in their factories or their farms or their shops or whatever it is that they wanted slave labour for. How many of them, if this maniacal future leader said, I want to have a poison to wipe out 1 million people, poison gas, whatever, how many companies will say, oh, well, we'll make that gas for you, or we'll make the bottles to put the gas in, or we'll build the slaughterhouses for you to go and herd people into? How many companies would participate and profit? And how many would stand strong and refuse, and possibly indeed face execution themselves sometimes for refusing? Personally, I wouldn't like to engage in any optimism around this one and imagine that there would be large numbers of modern day companies who would be all squeaky clean and say, oh, absolutely not, we won't do business with a monster like you. Because I would put money on it that there would be quite a few businesses who would just count the profits and look the other way and not think too much about the corpses and the slavery and all the other horrific things that were going on. They would just look at their bank accounts stacking up and up and up and up. And speaking of bank accounts, how many of the modern day banks would willingly do trade and business with someone like that, some maniacal extremist political leader? How many would happily take the finances from such a person and profit from the financial transactions of such a party or an organisation? A few, I bet, a few. So let's put Hitler into some degree of perspective, because he is the kind of go-to man as an image for evil and wickedness. Got around 6 million, give or take, deaths on his hands. Mao Zedong in China has way over 45, or had he's dead as well, way over 45 million deaths on his hands. Some of them outright murder and slaughter, but a hell of a large chunk of that were people starving to death as a result of his incredibly incompetent, stupid agricultural policies, which he insisted on driving through. And every time any of his politicians and minions stood up and said to him, no, Mr. Zedong, you are wrong, they would be shot, until everyone was just cowed into going along with his insane policies that resulted in the biggest starvation that's known of in human history, and also one of the least spoken about, at least in the West. We're very acutely aware of things like the famine in Ethiopia, but how many people know about the famines in China that were directly responsible, directly track backable, if that's a word, to the utter incompetence of the political leaders of China? It's just the extremes of communism has caused more deaths than just about any other political movement you care to imagine. Likewise, another example of a murderous communist regime, Stalin in Russia. Around 25 million deaths. A lot of those were people executed for speaking up, having opinions of their own. Massacres of various ethnic groups he despised, and various other types of groups he wanted to get shot of. He was ardently opposed to religion and had an awful lot of priests and nuns and what have you wiped out. A hell of a lot of those deaths, again, down to starvation. This time, deliberate, intentional starvation, more so than complete incompetence, where he just decided to wipe out large swathes of the Russian population. Other people were forced into chain gangs to work, building roads, building dams, building bridges, and as they died, their corpses would just be covered over in concrete and form part of the road or the bridge or whatever it was that was being created. They didn't even have funerals. They didn't even dig a grave to put them in. They just incorporated the ludicrously large number of dead bodies into the structure that they were creating. At the moment, death tolls for these other characters are still being worked out. Robert Mugabe, no longer around, good riddance. al-Bashir, Kim Jong-un, if indeed he is still around. That one is a bit open debate at the moment as to whether he's still breathing or not. Probably we will never know the full extent of how many people have been massacred, brutalized, exterminated in the most horrific, awful, dreadful ways by some of these extremist political leaders. Horrendous characters. But their regimes have been regimes which have needed to trade. Every regime needs to trade. Where does Robert Mugabe, oh, indeed he's dead now. Where did Robert Mugabe get his torture equipment from? Was it made in his own country? By corporations employed by him willing to manufacture torture equipment and sell it to Mugabe? Or was it made by foreign regimes and shipped in and sold for usage in his country? It doesn't really matter whether the corporation making it was a local one or a foreign one. The point being that someone somewhere, Robert Mugabe or one of his minions, goes along to a business and says, "Oh, can you make us equipment that we can electrocute people with, or we can torture them in one of 50 vile and unspeakable ways with?" And that company goes, "Oh, yeah, fine, it'll cost you so and so much for us to make torture equipment." There are people in factories making the torture equipment, knowing full well it's used to torture people, taking their wage packet, going home at the end of the day, and we have to assume trying very hard not to think about the suffering which their labour will ultimately cause. Likewise, back when Saddam Hussein was alive and using gas warfare to slaughter vast numbers of Kurds, someone had to manufacture those gas bombs, had to create the gas and put it in the metal shells and so forth, and profit from it. They didn't do that for free. They did it for a profit. All of these characters have, whether it's military uniforms, as in the Hugo Boss type of situation, all the way through to warfare, weapons of war, and weapons of torture. There are people making them, manufacturing them, profiting from them. Does anything go when it comes to business? As long as there's a profit, does it matter how much suffering is caused? Or should some forms of business be outlawed? There are companies in Britain who make torture equipment and sell it abroad. Should it be illegal? Should governments take steps to say no company based in Britain, in this case, or whatever country it happened to be in question, no company is allowed to make torture equipment, regardless of who they're selling it to, because torture is illegal and selling the equipment for it should also be illegal. Manufacturing the equipment for it should also be illegal. Or do we just let people buy and sell whatever the hell they can find to buy and sell? Is that what governments should be doing? So I'm asking you these questions. You're not in a position to answer them directly to me, but pause, have a coffee, think about what you would like the government of your country to do with respect to these sorts of business practices. And then whatever it is that you decide, maybe contact your local MP and let them know whether you're for it or against it, to say what your position is in terms of where the limitations of making money should reside. What about those companies that make these products more as a sideline, but also sell lots of other things too? Other things which possibly we as ordinary everyday people might be customers for. So not the bombs and the torture equipment, but they might make other stuff. Is there a responsibility on us as consumers to think, well, I know that this company is making money by selling murderous, horrendous objects and equipment and items, therefore I will not buy their other stuff that they're selling, their more mainstream legitimate stuff, because I don't want to financially support a company that is promoting death and suffering and pain and misery and despair on such a grand scale. Where does our responsibility? So all well and good going on and on about governments, if we ought to do this, ought to do that, ought to do the other. But we as customers also have a responsibility for where we put our money. And whilst the money we spend with them might be very small scale compared to perhaps what they get paid by sinister foreign regimes, nonetheless, should we be chipping into it, supporting it, or is there a duty on us to say, no, what you're doing is immoral and I will not engage with your company for so long as you are doing it at least, and maybe not ever? Open for debate there. Going back to the 1700s and the East India Company. Late 1700s, the East India Company set up a monopoly in India on opium buying. So there were lots of farmers in India growing opium. It was used both in medicine, but also as a narcotic, as a drug, in the opium dens. Um, just in case there's anyone unfamiliar in the class, opium is basically heroin. It's one of the more historically basic forms of heroin before the current processing techniques were developed to turn opium into heroin. But it's the same basic plant, the opium poppy. And it can be used as a painkiller in surgery and so on. But it's also obviously smoking opium. At that point in time in the late 1700s, it was mainly smoked. The notion of injecting heroin, that didn't come into play until the chemical processes needed to convert opium into heroin had been developed. So that was a slightly later phenomenon. At this stage, it was primarily smoked. And still there are still people in the world who smoke opium, but these days more and more people prefer to inject heroin rather than to smoke it. So the key point here is that the East India Company had an arrangement with the farmers in India that they would sell only to the East India Company and not to anyone else. And those arrangements were enforced by violence as well as by court process to make sure they had the monopoly on the trade. And we did speak about the problem with monopolies last week, but obviously there's a whole raft of other issues at play here. And that monopoly system stayed in place until 1947, just to give you a notion as to how recently the British trading corporations were involved in opium production, which is ultimately the heroin trade. Now, opium was known in China prior to this. It had been in use both as a medication and as a narcotic in China, but on a relatively small scale prior to this. So what happened in this period of history is that the British wanted to buy tea in vast quantities from China and set up a trade delegation with the Chinese emperor and say, well, we can sell you this, 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 and this, and in exchange we'd like to buy tea. And the Chinese emperor looked at the various things that were offered to him and said, don't want any of that, and refused. So they had no interest in a tea trade with Britain or with anyone else, quite happy to keep the tea in China, and didn't want the various things offered. The British then tried to promote the sale of opium in China as a trade for tea. So having the emperor not having been much interested in the other things on the table, they said, well, what about opium? We can sell opium to your people. And opium usage in China at that juncture was illegal because they'd seen the kinds of problems that came in opium dens. And so the Chinese emperor said, oh, we're not trading with you in opium because it's illegal over here. We don't want it. It's dangerous. It's far more grief than it's worth. And that led to a war, the first opium war, between not the East India Company, but between Britain as a government and China as a government. So even though China is vast, absolutely gargantuan as a country, and obviously Britain is quite tiny, nonetheless, Britain sailed out ships to China, and the British warships were more technologically advanced than the Chinese warships at that point in time. And we bombarded, between 1839 and 42, bombarded various coastal towns around China, bombed the hell out of them. Until such time as the Chinese emperor sued for peace and pleaded with the British to stop bombing and slaughtering Chinese people, and agreed to a trade deal in which the East India Company, on behalf of the British government, would sell opium and various other things to China and set up opium warehouses, and shops and what have you to retail opium across China. And in exchange, they would buy tea from the Chinese and distribute it not only to Britain itself, but to all of the various British colonies, which was half the known world at that point in time. And so basically, we forced the Chinese to start consuming opium in much larger scale than they'd ever done before, and indeed looked to set up the growth of opium fields in China as well as in India itself, and start growing, growing opium poppies over there. Part of that trade deal was not only the exchange of tea and opium, but also that Britain was given Hong Kong as a trading point because it was strategically placed. And so for many years, Hong Kong was British and still is, in many respects, it still has a lot of British culture and values and ideas. And even though it was given back to the Chinese eventually in the 20th century, there was such a strong British influence in Hong Kong that most Hong Kong people, as you can see from the riots and various things that have been going on there for the last year or two, strongly resent the Chinese government, fear the Chinese government, with good cause, it has to be said, because the Chinese government is unbelievably corrupt and prone to do horrific things in a very high-handed way to its own population. And so there's a lot of continued resentment from within Hong Kong as a sort of legacy of the British occupation there, but the resentment is not to the British so much as it is to the Chinese government, which is perceived as a very, very sinister force. So this remained in a period of peace in China for a little while before it flared up again, because the Chinese emperor was, even though he had signed that peace treaty, was seeing the scale of social problems of drug addiction and the horrendous problems coming from all of these opium dens across China, and was very resistant to it. There was a flare-up in one of the Chinese ports where some local Chinese people went and burnt down a warehouse owned by the British, which was stacked to the ceiling with opium. A vast fortune's worth of opium contained in this warehouse. They burnt it down because they were opposed to opium dens and drug addiction, and so on. They were dead against it. And there's a big kind of diplomatic flare-up between the British and the Chinese as to who should pay compensation or not get. The British demanded compensation, the Chinese refused to pay it. It went back and forth, back and forth. A few other spats flared up at the same time, and that led to the Second Opium War. And this time the French waded in to join in the Opium War because they wanted a cut of the profit too with the opium trade. Effectively, they wanted to start selling drugs to the Chinese, just as the British were selling drugs to the Chinese. So that flared up between 1856 and 1860, and eventually led to the Treaty of Tientsin, which completely legalized the trade in opium and made it much more extensive than it had been as a result of the policies and the treaties from the first Opium War. So this was complete full-on, the Treaty of Tientsin. All gloves off in the trade of opium, both with the French and with the British. And drug problems spread throughout China. They had massive drug problems. The Chinese, by this juncture, had also been populating a bit of an exodus. Chinese people going to America, going to Australia, going to Britain, going to various other countries, and setting up Chinese mini ghettos. So you get the Chinatown in London, and there's various Chinatowns in other parts of the world. So there's quite a diaspora of Chinese people around Europe and the New World. And one of the one of the problems that kicked in is that in places like London, Manchester, Liverpool, where you had Chinese communities, they brought the opium habit with them and they set up opium dens. And those opium dens were not only frequented by the Chinese people themselves and the various other ethnic groups that came in and lived in the port areas, but increasingly by the local British population, to the point where that started to become a serious worry for the British government. They were happy to sell opium to the Chinese and let the Chinese suffer the problems, but they didn't like it when those problems were brought home to Britain. And there were British people getting hooked on opium and going to the opium dens. with all of the problems of addiction that we're very familiar with today. And so you can, for example, read the Sherlock Holmes stories with Arthur Conan Doyle, makes a number of references to opium dens and the problems caused by opium dens and the social worries. A lot of the Victorian poets were off their face on opium half the time and wrote some of their best poetry whilst they were off their face on opium, because it was seen as causing visionary experiences, and they could go and write their poetry about the visionary experiences that they'd had whilst stoned out their face in an opium den. So it became a kind of a significant factor, and had a big impact, not just in terms of reaping the financial profits, but had a big impact in terms of the number of British people in Britain, let alone the ones who lived in China or lived in India or elsewhere, the number of British people in Britain who were getting opium habits as a result of this spread. And so we get this irony where at one point we're going to war to force other people to buy our drugs, and then we are having a war against drugs when they start selling them back to us. Irony of ironies. Now, this is a point where if we were all sitting together, we could have a discussion and a bit of a banter about the involvement of multinational businesses that you might have heard of and know about in some of the wars that are going on around the world at the moment, but we're not together, so maybe this is something you might want to chat to each other about through WhatsApp or via a chat facility or something like that, and start bouncing your ideas around to just to emphasise that whilst we've been talking about opium wars and the British East India Company and things happening hundreds and hundreds of years ago, this sort of stuff, business involvement in warfare, is still very much going on in the 21st century. It's not just a thing that happened hundreds and hundreds of years ago. A 2016 report from a campaign group called Global Justice Now listed the top 10 wealthiest economic forces in 2016. Now, the first 9 top 10, these are the richest, most powerful, most influential economic powers in the world in 2016. The top 9 were countries. Britain was the 6th on the list in 2016. The 10th most powerful, most wealthy, most influential force was Walmart. Friggin' supermarket. Which gives you a scale of just how colossally, insanely rich Walmart is. And that's owned by one family, a family who could give the Borgias a run for their money in terms of wealth, in terms of personal possessions and property and so forth. So that was 2016. What would it be in 2020? Time will tell. Will they still be predominantly countries, governments, or will we see more and more corporations creeping into the top 10? Of the top 100, 69 were corporations. 31 countries, 69 corporations. That is one hell of a chunk of phenomenally rich, phenomenally powerful institutions and organizations in the world. There are some institutions whose finances are very grey, shall we put it like that, very hard to pin down, such as the Catholic Church. It's quite difficult to work out just how rich the Catholic Church is. So it's possible there may be some groups that ought to be in the top 100 that aren't there because no one is entirely sure how much money they've got, because it's all a little bit cloak and dagger. So there might be some missing off that list. However, we are basically talking countries and corporations. So this, in effect, once upon a time, the top 100 would all have been companies. Sorry, all have been countries, all have been nation states. The fact that 69 of them are now corporations, what does that mean? It means that there are businesses which are richer than countries, richer than entire countries, who have pushed those countries off the top 100 list. Have a think about that. and what that means for the scale and wealth and power. Now, this to give you a bit of example, these figures are from a few years ago, a couple of years ago, so they might be a bit out of date now. But Tesco's, this is just Tesco's in Britain because some of these countries are also multinational. So Tesco's in Britain has, or had a couple of years ago, 500,000 employees across the whole country. What does that mean? Put it into a sense of scale. There are just over 133,000 people living in Ipswich. So Tesco's employs more than the entire population of Ipswich. In fact, so a couple of times more than the entire population of Ipswich, just to give a sense of scale there. We can jump ahead there to Walmart. Way over 2 million people are employed by Walmart worldwide. The entire population of the Isle of Wight barely even touches the sides of that. That's the population of Manchester is more than the employees of Walmart, but that is in effect saying that Walmart could virtually employ every single person living in Manchester. That's a phenomenal number of people. McDonald's just shy of 2 million people, more than the entire population of Luxembourg and Malta added together. That really gives a sense of scale. So there are companies who have more employees than some countries have population. Coming back to this notion of corporate imperialism, is this effect meaning that there are companies who may as well be countries in terms of how many people they can call upon as participants, as members, as, well, I suppose you almost might say citizens. So it gives a sense of how wealthy they are, how powerful they are, how much clout they have on the global stage. Nestle, as an example of this, kicked off in 1905 with a merger between the Anglo-Swiss Milk Company and Farine Lactée Henri Nestlé, which was a company set up by Henri Nestlé. So those two companies merged and founded and came together as what we now know as Nestlé. They had a massive growth spurt during the First World War and again in the years after the Second World War. These days they have over 8,000 brands. The other day I went to, my rare expeditions out there, went to one of the local supermarkets to do a bit of shopping. I personally don't like buying Nestle, that's just my hobby horse. But I was looking at the shelves and thinking, what can I buy? Oh, can't have that, that's Nestle. Oh, can't have that, that's Nestle. Oh, can't have that. By the time I'd put back all the things that were Nestle, there was bugger all left on the shelves. They own so many different brands. It's very, very difficult not to buy something that Nestle has manufactured because they're everywhere. So they went from being a milk company, collecting milk and manufacturing things like milk powder, to making coffee, milkshakes, breakfast cereal, baby food, soups, sauces, pet food, you name it, they do it. They've just got finger in pie after pie after pie after pie. So going back to last week's discussion around monopolies, there's all sorts of legal loopholes and ploys to get around monopolies, but it becomes somewhat ludicrous when you can go into a shop and virtually every product on the shelf is made by one company. And that gives you a scale, that picture there. Not only things like Nescafe, we'll be familiar with those over here quite easily, Kit Kats and Aeros we're all very familiar with, but as well as the food products, you've got things there, Maybelline, Garnier, sort of hair grooming products and whatnot, down to things like Armani, Yves Saint Laurent, a whole raft of other products that you would not automatically associate with Nestle. So if you think about these stuff in your cupboards, not only food products, but cleaning products, and in your kitchen cabinets, your shampoos and your perfumes and aftershaves and whatnot, and if you've got a cat or a dog, whatever food it is that you feed to your cat or your dog, how many products in your house would tick a box on here? Would turn out to have been made, manufactured, owned, profited towards Nestle. I bet it's a hell of a lot of. Now, some things on this list they don't necessarily sell in this country. I've never heard of Laffy Taffy in this country. So some things are marketed in other parts of the world rather than marketed here. But there's going to be a hell of a lot of things in your house, my house, most people's houses, who ultimately track back to Nestle. Is that a good thing? Do we just say, well done, Nestle, on being so industrious? Or do we see this as a somewhat sinister form of driving rival companies out of the market and monopolizing and muscling in and taking over more and more and more and more companies and products and corporations and bringing in their own business practices and so forth as a result of this? Because that idea we were talking about right at the start of when one country invades another country, often the invaded country is expected to learn the language, take on board culture, and so on. The same is true in business. One business takes over another business. It brings in its own corporate attitudes, practices, cultural standards, which the bought-out business then has to get used to. Then if the employees don't like it, well, they either have to put up and shut up or leave and go somewhere else entirely. If there is anywhere else to go to, this is another factor. When the same company owns just about every business in town, is there anywhere else for you to go to as an employee that won't be operated by the values and standards of the company you want to get away from? Debatable. Nestle itself, we've mentioned some of these issues in previous classes. We've been discussing different topics and what have you. So just this is more of a recap, really, rather than an introduction to something new. But Nestle has had scandal after scandal after scandal impacting it. So back to 2008, in Hong Kong, the government there discovered melamine in Nestle milk products made in a factory based in China, so Nestle with a presence in China. There. 6 children are known to have died from kidney damage as a result of the melamine. Another 860 babies were hospitalised but did eventually recover with varying levels of harm caused to them. Has it significantly damaged Nestle? No, they're still rolling along and they're still worth billions and billions and billions. 2015, in India, they found a noodle product called Maggi had up to 17 times the safe amount of lead in it. Did that stop the corporate machine that is Nestle from rolling on? No, still does. Boycott was started going as far back as 1977 against Nestle, particularly their milk products, and spread and still goes on. Still people around the world who boycott Nestle products, in as much as it is actually possible to boycott Nestle products, going back to this issue, that they seem to own virtually everything that's out there. One of the key factors that promoted that 1977 boycott was the hard sell promotion of Nestle dried milk products to mothers in a lot of poor and developing countries, rather than the preferred option of getting those mothers to use breast milk. If a woman doesn't breastfeed, eventually she dries up, and then the whole family become reliant on buying more and more milk, substitute dry milk products, baby formula, what have you. Which, if you've got a good income and you're living a nice, comfortable middle-class existence in the West, is, I suppose, your choice at the end of the day. But if you're an impoverished family, you become reliant on a product, that price goes up and up and up, and you find yourself struggling to make ends meet. Your babies need to be fed. The mother in question is no longer producing breast milk, so what's the alternative except to buy baby formula no matter what the price is, or let the babies starve? that's the kind of issue that those protest movements were against. So, in other words, if women from well-off countries, well-off families want to buy milk formula, that's their choice. Get on with it. But the problem is where it's targeted at those who are desperately poor and struggling to survive, where they would be much, much better off going down nature's route of breastfeeding the child and therefore being able to continue breastfeeding whatever future children they have, rather than becoming reliant on increasingly expensive milk substitute products. That boycott remained in place until '84, when it was suspended after Nestle agreed to go down the lines of this new marketing code that was introduced. Come 2011, Nestle is currently the only, or was in 2011, I'm not sure if that's still the case in 2020, but at least in 2011 it was, the only infant formula manufacturer to have met the 104 criteria involved in manufacturing good standard. So is this an example of Nestle actually taking on board the complaints and, at least on this occasion, significantly improving and leading the market, rather than making the horrendous mistakes they keep making in other areas of their vast and sprawling empire of production? Open to debate, because concerns, as you can see from the bottom there, have emerged around the marketing ploys and pressurising and pushing in Laos of formula in preference to breast milk. So is this going back? So having done really well on these 104 criteria, are there parts of the world where the old problems that were causing such concern in the late 1970s re-emerging? One step forward, two steps back, perhaps. Flash forward to the year 2000 and the World Water Forum. Nestle and a number of other corporations put it to the World Water Council and convinced them to change one of their policy documents and statements to alter the definition of drinking water from its previous version, pre-2000 version, where drinking water was referred to as a right. Everyone had the right to drinking water, clean, fresh drinking water, not polluted, dirty drinking water, proper drinking water. That word was changed from right to need. Now, you might say, well, so what? What's in a word? Isn't this all just a bit of a quibble? When that much pressure is brought to bear, you can be sure that there is a hell of a lot more to this than just a quibble over semantics. What is the quibble? When something is a right, people have legal access to it. When something is a need, they do not have legal access to it. Where does this take us in the 20 years since that particular World Water Forum? Well, Nestle have been buying up in lots of different countries, not only in impoverished and developing countries, but even in wealthy places like America. They have been buying up lakes, rivers, and other freshwater supplies left, right, and centre, bottling them, running the water supplies virtually dry, so that people can't go to the lakes and rivers anymore because they're now sold off and have property rights owned by Nestle. So they now have to go to the shop and buy the bottled water from the river down the road, which they're not allowed to go to anymore, or which is indeed in some cases dried up completely down the road, causing desertification and all sorts of aridity problems in the land. I can't play that YouTube clip to you because it causes chaos on the recording, but you can go into the PowerPoint and click on it and play it yourself, which will give you the American experience of what it is like to have your local rivers and lakes owned by and then dried up by Nestle, who sell you back what was once a completely free completely free resource. You could have just gone down to the river and filled a bucket or whatever and got water from the river. Now you have to go to the shop and buy it. One of the issues flagged up in that video recording is that one of the former, he's no longer the CEO of Nestle, but one of the former CEOs of Nestle is on record on video at a conference saying that people have no right to water. And this flags up that whole squabble around the words right and need. People have no right to fresh running water. They have a need for it, and if they need it, and who the hell doesn't need water, then they have to buy it. And buy it from who? Well, at the moment over here, we're buying from various water supply companies, but in some parts of the world, they're buying from Nestle. And the ambition, quite naked ambition, stated by that former CEO, who's on record stating it, is that he envisions a future, not too many years into the future, where Nestle has become the dominant water control company in the whole world, where Nestle owns just about every water resource going that it can find to own, and bottling and selling and transporting water to those people who can afford to pay for it, and not to the people who can't afford to pay for it. You can't afford the price, tough luck, go without. Even if that means you die of thirst, go without. That's the kind of world that this one particular multinational is striving to create, and no doubt there will be other multinationals out there who would like a chunk of that action, who would also like to see that kind of future happening. And there are arguments. Yuval Noah Harari, an Israeli philosopher, has made the argument that in the future we won't be seeing people going to war for coal or going to war for gold or going to war for iron ore and the kind of things they used to go to war for in the centuries past. One of the things we will see people in the future, countries in the future, going to war for is access to water. Because water, as the human population gets bigger and bigger and bigger and has more and more of a devastating impact on the environment, water will become more and more precious, especially in those parts of the world that are prone to aridity anyway. I suppose if you're in Ireland or Britain where it rains a hell of a lot, that will be somewhat less of an issue. But in those parts of the world that are prone to being dry at the best of times, then there will be countries going to war for control of water supplies. Fresh water will be that precious a commodity. And so these are multinational corporations muscling in on what were once the province of countries and governments. You can kind of see where this might be going in the future. Is water a need or a right? Is it a human right that we need water, we'll die without it, die of thirst, and suffer all sorts of diseases and problems if we don't have fresh running water? Is that a human right that should be supplied by governments to make sure all of their citizens, regardless of how rich or poor they might be, have access to fresh running water? Or is this now a privilege of those who can afford it and tough luck on those who can't? Bearing in mind that as prices go up and up and up, the number of people who can't afford it might get larger and larger and larger. Grim thought to end on. But next week's lecture, which will of course be the final lecture of this module and of this academic year, we'll look at the ethics of taxation. It may sound like a bit of a dry subject, but actually there's all sorts of potentially interesting different styles of taxation, what should or should not be taxed, and the rates at which it should be taxed, and so on. So we'll look at some of those theories and at issues of consumer ethics, and I'll give you some advice for those of you who are working on the case studies that would have been an exam, but don't have a case study, of the kinds of arguments that are worth making and incorporating into your respective case studies to bump your grade up. So next week's one will definitely be worth listening to. And just a reminder, when you listen to these lectures, regardless of whether you listen to 5 minutes worth or the entire lot, when you listen to them, your name is logged by the system. And so when it comes to filling in the registers, I'm filling them in as to who has watched what in any given week. So it doesn't matter when you watch them, whether you watch them, listen to them on a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, whenever. Come the end of term, I'll be sitting down, going through the records on Brightspace and ticking off the registers to say, oh, Michael's listened to this and Rose has listened to that, and that will be your registry of attendance. So it's worth listening to them in order to get the registry ticked off. Hope you're all staying safe. Take care. and you'll hear from me next week.